token to this value is kind of looking at very narrow palette, which is already in traditional economy much wider. That's my
responding to both of these points about maybe a bit of a tangent, but quantifying quality or quantifying these softer considerations, care, etc. And my background is electrical engineering, so in electrical engineering you have a 0 and you have a 1. In a lot of, and this is not a very rich space, it's very binary. But if you put a lot of 0s and 1s in a stream, and then you layer those streams in like a two-dimensional, say a TV, each pixel has a bunch of 0s and 1s, and together this very rich signal, even though individual pieces, and I think we're at that point with token economies and token ecosystems, is that you can't quantify that thing that shouldn't be quantified. No, but we can represent quality. Like, how do you quantify a rainbow? You can't, but you can feed a stream of quantifiable bits, 0s and 1s, into this matrix of. I'm gonna get mine. Can you give me one?
I got 2 hands. I can
yeah, maybe we're going too much philosophical, but yeah, for example, like in social network analysis, if we have to measure the trust in a network, we probably would use some multi-layer model. And in this sense, like I agree with you that the representation would be like a tensor basically. And you have different metrics measuring different kind of human interactions. Still, it will be not complete, but will be maybe good enough to grasp the concept of trust in the specific context, in the specific cultural social context. Even though I don't know. I think that my point was like that we always can miss something, and I forgot. I wanted to say something else, but in any way, like it's I think it's really important to study the anthropological context and also the cognitive mechanisms that are behind the interpretation of such concepts. And I don't know. I will tell you later. It's really short.
Thank you. The original title of the talk was political economy of crypto, and I feel like a very interesting conversation, but a little bit abstract. So I wanted to maybe try to make it a bit more tangible. And I'm very curious what the common stack people think about, because I think it's very related to token engineering. Like, I think a lot of the things that we're sort of describing is sort of like the things that a state should be doing if it was like, you know, rational and like good and like actually gave a shit about you know, normal people in the environment and all these good things. But we don't live in a world like that, so sort of the issue that we're sort of faced with is like we can't really just overthrow our state and like enact our ideal one at the moment. So we're sort of looking for solutions outside of that in a way that can sort of like influence and like redirect or really, I think, do the mechanisms that a state should be doing at the moment, but it's failing to do, right? And especially with these, how you guys are talking about these tokens and what you would want them to achieve.
So let me kind of make a point about like, you mean in this like the contention or lack of contention with the extant institutions look like they exist, they're maybe failing. Let's just like leave it out there. What we can do in practice though is recognize the common pool of resources in front of us that we're consuming or producing and try to build healthier institutions for them. At least from my perspective, look, like I'm a researcher, I like doing research, I want that to be a knowledge commons and not a walled garden, and most of the motivation is to say, look, I know what I like doing, I know that I'm good at doing those things, and that I want to produce a thing that is not something that I hold hostage, but rather something that I not only share, but I make discoverable, learnable, and applicable for others. And so like and again, it's sort of, if I stop there for a moment and say like, what if we just figure out how to manage that common pool resource, the one that we're most familiar with for us? And like, yeah, okay, there's a lot of maybe more important ones, arguably related to environmental crises, but like if we start to get the hang of the ones that we really do kind of own, like if I'm going to produce a knowledge commons, then I don't want to compete with somebody else for the right to try to build an institution to take care of that. And so like, let me just start there, and like for me that's around my own research and my team and my own contributions to the token engineering field and, you know, hopefully more social institution kind of thing. And then of course that feeds into things like the common stack, which has got certain specific patterns they're testing out and codifying and experimenting and learning from and so on. And there's a kind of ecology of institutional experiments around resources that are ours. We're not, and again, to the points earlier, maybe it's more important to deal with these other common pool resources that are going to help us deal with the environmental crisis and all sorts of issues that arise at people's real vulnerabilities level. But like, until we start going in and saying, well, I'm going to tell you how to build an institution to maintain and care for your common pool resources, I can just start with the common pool resources I'm producing and try to get better at managing those.
Indeed. So like what I see is that like it's a experimental like playground for, you know, these are the commons that we can control at the moment. I can't control the commons of like, you know, my neighborhood because there are too many other things I have to deal with, but I can do it over this digital space, which is like basically a blank slate, where we are producing things with each other. We can sort of play around and see how we manage those for potentially some sort of like future at least lessons learned, you know, and like apply that to more bigger pressing issues. I think that's sort of like the long-term goal of a lot of people here. But I guess the question, so the quick question is, do you see, is one of the purposes of common stack and tokens engineering around essentially funding, I mean the meme really in the near space is funding public goods, and really I would say funding public things, because sometimes I think we say goods, but the goods aren't necessarily always good.
That meme is pretty shallow in that it doesn't really provide a clear definition of what's public good.
Yeah,
So,
Can I only manage 4 cups, but I got
So yeah. I don't know. Very fast for months.
No, I don't want it.
You don't want it?
No, he does. As far as the common stack providing public goods, absolutely, that is definitely the goal. I really want to jive off what he said though, that it's like, you know, he's a researcher, I'm a builder organizer. I don't do anything besides talk to people, but like, it's scope creep, man. It's like, it would be great to go start building the roads for everybody. How are you going to get the road builders to use MetaMask? I mean, come on. It's like, we gotta start where things are most advantageous. And for the common stack, it's like token engineering in the Web3 space seems to be the place where we can have the biggest impact with the least scope, right? Staying in the digital space. But in the end, the goal is, it doesn't even have to be the common stack. I mean, the common stack is more of a think tank than anything else. It's really about getting this idea out there that what if instead of trying to overthrow governments or even replace them, we just outcompete them. Let's just solve the problems that aren't being solved.
So like this notion of like outcompeting governments. I mean, I have like I can see why that is, and like I have like mixed feelings about it at the same time. It's like to me, what it brings to mind is like I mean, basically privatization as like a competing force against like public services in like a more like real context sometimes. 'Cause, like you can, like this is a very like neoliberal idea. I think sometimes you know, we'll have, at least in countries outside the U.S., you know, we have like our public health system, and then we have like are competing like private health system where you get like a little prize or you get an extra gift because you get to the doctor or whatever, you get a nicer room. It's like I think like the ethos of like funding public good I think is like really interesting, like really cool, and I think the political economy around it, I really don't know how to describe it yet, because that's the way I can do it is like libertarian social democracy, which is like very contradictory and very strange. But but like my fear, it sort of ends up being co-opted to facilitate or it's like into the needs of basically capital and for like basically encouraging privatization as opposed to what is the like how it should be done, or like what would be good and what would be ideal is that it is done in like in a democratic fashion, and like it basically I want my public my public services and my public goods to function just like I do my universal healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's traumatized by scarcity economics, and it's like it's not all about privatization. It doesn't have to be, at least. You can create like the political spectrum of the common stack is really playing on both ends. And Jeff was just probably going to say this.
I have an image. I would love to pull up that now, but I'll share it.
Well, I mean, he was just talking about this. We were talking about this, and I don't know, it was 2 days ago. It's like we're going to go to the Commons gathering, and it's like they're going to think we're libertarians, and really, it's like we're just trying to take the best out of both worlds. There is value in competition, right? And there is value in incentive alignment, and like there is value in some of the libertarian thought, but there's also no heart in that shit. Right? There's no thought about. There's a huge lack of understanding of like culture and value in the public domain, and really abundance economics, which I feel like is very at the heart of the more social anarchist side, right? And so I see the common stack as like there it is, building a bridge between communism and libertarianism.
And this is very crude compared to the political economists could probably phrase it much better than these simple terms, but I do see the divide being bridged as the strength is that it's bridging from both to create something new. And
and this is a complex question because I think there's also a lot of worthy of consideration in the point you're bringing. It's a nuance thing. One might have the best intentions and still fall into the fit traps that some of them are outlined in the points you're making. Nevertheless, so first of all, in a very practical point, if one thinks about public goods, to use that simple term, if one starts from the things that the states are in many places already failing to maintain, there are public goods that used to exist and start to erode, or that have been mutated and transformed, let's say academic knowledge, to already being in a kind of capitalistic trap. Then those forms can take a very different place. Like to just highlight something, how this is a very two-sided issue, is like, what if you create a new collective form, but the collective form can only come to be by that there is some structure of investment to it, but what results from it is a collective. Now, what is that? Like it's well, you could kind of simplify and say it's like just another company that this is in this way capitalism. But what if the collective form really has a different kind of decision pattern, and it's made towards like to be an architecture of how can we come together in forms that are other than the state or sub-nation structures and form larger collectives. Because this is an area that crypto could approach, or the technology is coming from could approach. And it might be very necessary, because I think it's a valid argument to make that the state seems at best maintaining, but usually eroding most of the structures that we apply to it. And this makes this whole thing quite complicated, and this is why like pursuing these forms cannot just be put, let's say, in the service of the capital, but while still retaining that there are those big traps. There are along the way. Crypto has, like, especially from its start, fallen into those traps many, many times. But still, I think that it's a valid pursuit to search new forms of co-activity.
I also want to add that there's a lot of, at least in, informing my perspectives, quite a bit of knowledge of the extant devolution of the institutions that manage the physical public infrastructures. So I'm like, I'm kind of in my own little space trying to explore and understand, but it includes collaboration with ethnographic researchers who are studying automation in society. I have experience with and knowledge of some other cyber-physical systems. I have some knowledge of the way specific institutions that manage transportation infrastructure are currently operating and have operated in the past, and what they're doing well and their modes of failure through people that I speak with in those institutions. And so it's, at least from my perspective, what we're basically saying is that the available arrays of social organization are insufficient for solving the kind of, we'll call them resource allocation problems, especially where the resources need to be allocated from individuals to serve the maintenance of, not even the creation of new, but the maintenance of existing shared resources. And the current political economy, whether it's a market or the current states or pretty much anything we've come up with for sure, has not actually demonstrated success in being able to support, and again, I'm going to focus on the maintenance of more than the production. We do a decent job with, yay, shiny new thing that we all want. We do a fucking terrible job with that thing that got made 10 years ago and that we all rely on, and we just get pissed when someone has to close part of it for maintenance, or when you have to spend money to keep it, it's already there, and it degrades.
The reason that is because of this, the rise of neoliberalism and of thinking of the states like a corporation almost, and thinking about, budgets and.
I'm not arguing against that. I'm just observing, and I think I'm probably closer to your positioning even than some of the common stack official language, because I view it more as a very open design space where we have a bunch of data points, and what we're really doing is trying to throw up a few more data points in the spaces in between to try to get a better model of what might work for maybe a different set of goals. Because in the neoliberal criticisms, we're really taking as given a set of optimization objectives, and that the whole framing of economy creates a certain attractor to a certain type of behavior. And I very much am my discussion earlier about constraint rather than maximization based, that reframing actually completely changes the decisions. You could take everything else you could keep constant, and just shifting things from optimizing what is effectively a kind of capital accumulation or even a utility maximization with multiple terms, and just shifting away, pushing a lot of the things that you want to conserve into the constraint regime, leads to massively different decisions about resource allocations. They, at least in my opinion, does a much better job with maintenance, because those constraints include keeping the thing we depend on healthy, changes the resource allocation decisions. But I'm also not saying this solves all the things. I'm actually just trying to say fundamental reframings are the only way to create significantly different solutions, regardless of whether it's a market or a state or whatever.
Yeah. But I think if I understand correctly, kind of what you're describing, and maybe I'm just having my own ideas on it, but is basically the designing what are the social relationships to the means of production, almost, right? It's I don't think resource allocation is a problem, but I don't think resource allocation is a root problem. It's our relationship to production that sort of creates how things are allocated. Right, and under a capitalist system, you have capitalists and you have workers, in a simple sense, and capitalists they optimize for accumulation of capital, because that is what structurally the system is sort of like telling you to do and is advocating for you to do and encouraging you.
I think we're saying something. Basically what I'm saying is how you frame the value imputes the resource allocation solution. So like if you say that like there's just a bunch of people with needs that need to be
What do you
met.
mean by value?
I mean literally like in an abstract sense, what we value, what we measure, what we strive for. Like it's in the sense that if I'm going to make a decision, even just me privately within the regime I have direct control over, I either explicitly or implicitly, so I either impute value through my choice even if I didn't think about it, or like a value relation. If I expend my time, energy, attention on something, I'm imputing value on it, that's implicit. Or I could make it more explicit, where I sit back and I actually extend time, value, like the attention, to think about what I want to do and then do it. I've actually extended even more resources to make a decision how to allocate my time and attention. What I'm basically saying is that, like if I start from a notion, very local notion of value in terms of a choice to extend some resource that's in my control, then I can extrapolate that concept to even larger institutions, whether they compute value or not. They sort of impute value on something when they prioritize it. So you get a very abstract notion of value, which is kind of inherited. But what I would argue is that that's not, it's not fundamental. Like when you look at how things are understood and framed, again, regardless of whether it's explicit or implicit, that ends up giving rise to the decisions, the resource allocations, including the attention, time and effort of individuals. And then if you look at that, what's happening is you have a way of understanding what is valued, even if it's not that someone is sitting up and you don't have an anthropomorphized institution saying, we value this, but you can look at an emergent institution and what resource allocations it makes, where it puts its resources, time, attention, capital, like time and attention here being substitutes for labor, but with some notion of specialization, because you can have non-fungible labor with different capabilities. But like at the end of the day, you can look at even an emergent institution, how those constrained resources are allocated, and see that as imputing value on things. Now it might be shitty, and we might go, shit, this isn't what we value, we need to value this other thing. That's a way of saying, oh fuck, our institutions are screwy, how do we get the value imputed by them to more line up with maybe what we feel it needs to be valued?
So I think what I'm getting at is that, so I agree more or less, like that's true, like you can sort of tell the values of the system based on sort of like what it's optimizing if you're trying to investigate and sort of like reverse engineer, what do they actually care about. I think there's a difference between the values that you say you have, of course, and the values that, of course, that the system actually doesn't. But yeah, I guess my thing is obviously just like, I think that the best way to, and it's extremely difficult, of course, to like change the value that you're trying to impute is to change that social relationship to the things that you're producing.
But first you have to realize that what you're saying you value and what values being imputed by your institutions aren't the same. Because before you can get into that, like if you think of it as a process that has certain loops in it, effectively you can't actually steer if there's no notion of like, here's what we wish we were valuing, and here's what our, as they are operating, institutions are imputing value upon, and there's a deviation here. And I'm not saying you can have a perfect model, but if you can tell that they're pointed away from each other, then your attempts to reframe these relationships really are in pursuit of closing that angle. And all we could realistically do is acknowledge that there's an error in that angle and try to take steps to close the error in that angle.
I think one of the problematics when we're having discussions around the concept of value is that it's for me it's a concept that is in a very contorted state, like it's been twisted, because like ultimately I think one can make it fairly simple if you for a moment ditch all economy now to the side and the current, let's say, cultural impositions on value. So if we think of value in terms of how we utilize it in our basic operations, it's actually kind of ever-present So I'll continue from my earlier example, like a person wanting, say, solitude. That is suddenly something that they value. And then let's say they actually pay extra for the room just to get this solitude. But then after 2 hours, they suddenly start craving food. Suddenly their solitude has gone way down in value, and suddenly food is valuable. I could go on with infinite examples that can constantly change, and at the same time, there are 3 or 4 factors you might kind of be able to name, which can keep on going up and down. This is very natural for us. If we think of like that there is this engine of prioritization, which is actually pretty useful for our basic operations. Like we can like essentially cognize for ourselves like an idea, but the fact that we have this sort of prioritization that can constantly float, it's a pretty useful thing. And it's simple, but it creates essentially like an infinite variety, keeping changing infinitely. But the contortion, I think, comes from the fact that because the current like economic structures that have a kind of vested interest and, well, also a kind of interest in systematic simplicity, have kind of valorized this concept of value, the universality of it, and so on. But like there's even many good reasons for that. But nevertheless, it puts us in this contorted position that when we are often talking about value, we are talking about this artifice we made, like the universalization, and then what we're putting aside is how value works within us. And if you separate them, things become much more simple. Like for me, like starting from this, actually the human basis makes a value like both a very versatile thing, but ultimately a simple engine creating that versatility. And I think that separation introduces clarity to thinking. Like what is called value in this sort of economic sense is a totally different thing, even though it shares the name.
Yeah, money trauma.
Yes, money trauma.
We need to exercise our collective money
That's a good
trauma.
name for a TV series.
So question for you. So in this universality, universal, like, construct for value, to me that sounds a bit like the kind of tool that something like a center of mass is. There's no, like, look at, where's the Earth? Well, you put it at the point which is the center of mass, but like, that's not actually a thing.
Yeah.
That's actually a thing that we invented in order to explain a certain phenomenon. So like, it's at once really important to discard it when it's the wrong tool,
Yes.
but at the same time to recognize that, much like the center of mass, in the right context, it's a very powerful tool.
Yes, exactly. Agreed.
I just want to say at some point I want to talk about cybernetics. Now that it is.
I might have to make my wife run soon, but
You want to go?
oh yes.
Yeah, about the concept of value, I wanted to add something at the conversation. There is a very nice book, one of the most famous by David Graeber, the Anthropological Theory of Value. And I think one of the main points is of the book is actually against this universal concept of value, and talking about arenas of value. So the idea was to look at the power relations that you have in this arena, and how these power relations actually are shaping the concept of value, because you are free to do what you value the most when you're really free to do it. I don't know if it's maybe I can rephrase, but the idea is that we are starting from the assumption that everyone is free to do what he or she values the most.
So I thought, kind of going, I know that I keep relying on this tool, but in this notion of constraints, what it's essentially saying is that what you value, like, actually, is what you do after your, like, constraints are satisfied. So, like, if my constraints are not met, my real needs, then, like, what's gonna happen is that I'm not gonna have the power to pursue the things that I sort of value in like a intrinsic or like a direct way. I have to first deal with satisfying my constraints. But that doesn't mean that I value money because I say go get money in order to pay for, shelter, food, and whatnot. What it means is that as a living human being and participant in society, I have a sort of set of constraints that I must first satisfy. But like I would interpret what you're saying as saying like I don't have very much power if I have everything I do with my resources, my attention and time is merely to meet my constraints. But once I am able to meet them, whether it's because I have some capital or some preserved energy, or it doesn't matter how I manage to satisfy them. Maybe I have a patron who just gives me a place to live and food, and suddenly I am free of those constraints, and I allocate my time and effort to research something that I find valuable, or to learn to play music. It doesn't matter. But the point is the value, at least in this articulation, isn't really exposed until after you get past the point where those like constraints are met, because you can, and maybe I'm trying to tie this back to the notion that I'm effectively powerless as long as I have to use basically everything I've got to meet my first order constraints. I start to have at least a notion of power over myself when I can start to use my time and attention and effort to pursue something that I value. Now the notion of value is local to me though, because I have imputed value on the thing when I have chosen to use my now unconstrained time and attention in pursuit of that thing. And that now I don't have to answer to some exogenous notion of productivity, because the only reason I'm answering to that exogenous notion of productivity is to get what I need to meet my constraints. I'm not actually, I haven't read the book that you're alluding to. I just kind of wanted to like riff on the ideas because I see some important structural relationship between, or the differences between what I do because I must do it and what I do when there isn't something I must do.
Okay. Yeah, even though sometimes the controversial value can be really subjective. And I mean, that's why I think in this field it's also interesting to bring psychology and cognitive science, because sometimes also the authority as a concept can be something that I internalized. I don't know if it's internalized. And so it's my cognitive, my perception of authority that implies the existence, and also how, as a subject, how I interpret this power, because the same authority for me will give me some constraints that might be different from the constraints that, because it depends on the way he interprets this concept of authority and it is the rate of his value.
Yeah, I mean, like not to go into a critique of Greber and respecting him as a writer. Like in this point, I still think it's because for me the argument is still in this sort of like this whole scale of value is still in unison, and while the analytics in itself can be perceptive, I think it makes the actual processing of this much more clear if we separate the actual kind of value systems you talk about and what I would almost think like a sense of valuation. Like am I using sense almost literal, because it behaves like a sense. Like I sense that I value this now, and you can these of course into these two parts, and where the kind of Greber text you're describing as, it is in that interplay that it's very valid to analyze the interplay. But for me, there is a clarity. You start before that analysis, separate these things because they are way too tied in the kind of cultural.
It sounds like there's a need to differentiate between value processes and value like objects. The object is an abstraction.
Yeah.
In fact, I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking valuation processes, though, I would argue there's at least two that are kind of dual to each other, because I can compute value by reasoning, looking at the thing, and I'm thinking about how I would value, but that's almost a passive process. I see, and I think, and I compute, and I create this abstract object of value. But my earlier use of the term impute is the opposite. I don't have to think at all, I do, and then maybe I have, in order to create this, I have to make the abstraction after the fact, but I would say that act, this is the notion of a revealed preference, even if the person doesn't realize they've done it. When you do a thing, you impute, but in both of these cases, those are processes that are highly contextual, and they instantiate an object of the type value. And so like process versus object, there's the localized realized computed, the localized realized imputed, and there's also the generalized abstract notion. We've talked about all of them. We have 3 instances of the object value already, and 2 instances of the process to value. And I think there's like an inherent plurality once we realize these. Again, I know it's very abstract, but it helps us get away from narrowing in on the notion that there is a value and says there are objects of the class value and they are instantiated and in a sense a process makes one. And there's no guarantee that even different processes of making an instance of value are mutually consistent.
Yeah, exactly. And this is also like, there is a thread there which I think kind of speaks, for me at least, even more strongly to this sort of almost like sales lab or like the evaluation process. And that is like, when you say this, it can be this sort of almost like an automated pattern of evaluation. But that's kind of already a valuation act that you have values that pattern to make that choice. But that's actually what happens with senses as well. Like when we see something, we develop these patterns and we automate what we see. Actually, we don't reconsider like, oh, that's a chair, and then we don't even see the details. We just go past it. We automate that process, and there is this sort of similarity in that process. So for me, it's really like this sort of valuation is one of these very rich interactions. Or for us, kind of generations of kind of sensory like data to our process. And essentially the whole world can be the choice of like, we can see like our water glass and research with some value to that. And we do that so constantly that it's probably not often. But this is exactly the reason why the structures around this kind of perception or around this kind of dimension in our sensing are so ever present, but they are different things. Just like a manner of sensing is very different from an object. Like those are 2 different things. That's more or less how I think about it.
But conflating them really makes it hard. So
Yeah.
So the moment they get mixed together, like the discourse, the logic, it starts to be muddled, and like you might feel as though you come to a conclusion, but what you don't realize is that if you inadvertently lost the differentiation between the process or the act of computing or imputing or evaluating as distinct from the instance of value, and even that is unique, and that again it's derived from a context, you're pretty much screwed. Because inevitably your logic is going to break down. And I'm not saying you might not build some intuition from the exploration, but you don't have something that you can actually use as an assumption to reason further. Like you're stuck.